Chapter 2 St. James's Palace, the Green Park and St. James's Park. Without wishing in any degree to alarm the august inhabitants of St. James's Palace, one cannot help saying that, owing to incidents that have occurred there, according to history and tradition, in the past, it would not be at all surprising to find that it harbored ghosts galore, and that denizens of another world foregathered there in large numbers. Many centuries ago, exactly how many it is impossible to say, according to the historian Stowe, there stood on the site the palace now occupies a religious institution, dedicated to Saint James the Less, Bishop of Jerusalem. Whence, we suppose, the palace, now a royal residence, derives its name. The institution, presumably, was nothing more or less than a hospital, its inmates consisting of 14 sisters, maidens, that were lepers, living chastely and honestly in divine service, and certain citizens of London, with the generosity that is so frequently a characteristic of the business men of our great metropolis, subscribed liberally in money and lands to its upkeep. Some idea of its age may be deduced from the fact that it was rebuilt by Berkinge, Abbot of Westminster, in the reign of Henry III. The privilege of an annual fair, to be held on the eve of St. James and the 6 following days, was granted to it by Edward I, who decreed that all the profits therefrom should be handed over to the hospital, the custody of which was subsequently granted to Eton College by Henry VI. It then continued, in a more or less flourishing state, till Henry VIII, in his pretended zeal for a reformed religion, ordained the dissolution of the monasteries. Coveting the ground the hospital stood on, he classed it with the monasteries, on the plea that it was founded on a religious basis, and, when it was pulled down, he erected on its site a mansion for his own private use and pleasure. Standing amid a fairy land of flowers, and bordered by woods which Henry took good care should be well stocked with game, it was an ideal country residence, and with a cockpit and a tilting yard added, left nothing in the way of sport to be desired. The tilting yard occupied the space now known as Horse Guards Parade. Doubtless Henry had many an orgy in his new abode, and there is no doubt, also, that it witnessed more than one outrageous act of cruelty, for kings in those days, especially kings of the temperament and character of this Tudor monarch, made short work of those who had the misfortune to incur their displeasure. Hence, the not infrequent discovery in royal demesnes of cunningly concealed human bones. It was here, within this palace, that hapless Charles I spent his last night on earth, a fact that might well have given rise to a haunting, if acute emotions be, as I firmly believe them not infrequently to be, the forerunners of ghostly happenings. It was not, however, until the reign of the second Charles that we find an actual case of haunting in the royal palace recorded. Among the numerous mistresses of the merry monarch was the Duchesse de Mazarin, who, according to tradition, was as fair as she was frail. That she was so in very truth, I myself believe, because there is little doubt that Charles was an unerring connoisseur of feminine beauty, and had an almost uncanny flair for detecting latent passion and a tendency to frailty in the other sex. The Duchess's greatest woman friend was Madame de Beauclerc, mistress of the Duke of York, also, according to tradition, more than ordinarily beautiful, and between these two women there existed a depth of attachment that was rarely to be met with in a royal court of olden days. After the burning of Whitehall, both ladies were awarded very handsome apartments in the stable yard of St. James's Palace. After a while, Charles and James, discovering younger beauties, paid little heed to the Duchess and Madame de Beauclerc. However, the neglected ones found consolation in each other's company, and, in their solitude, began to think seriously of the problem of another life. They then made a compact that whichever of them should pass away first should return, if it were possible to do so, and inform the survivor of how she was faring in the other world. This compact was continually discussed, both women being very much in earnest, and the Duchess happening to be suddenly taken very ill, Madame de Beauclerc reminded her of it, whereupon the Duchess assured Madame de Beauclerc that she might depend on the pledge she, the Duchess, had so often given. An hour after this conversation, which was carried on in the presence of several other people, the Duchess died. Some years later, the author of and authority for this story, one paid a visit to Madame de Beauclerc, and their conversation turning on the problem of another world, Madame de Beauclerc expressed her disbelief in one with considerable emphasis, declaring that she had sufficient reason for so doing in the failure of her friend, the Duchess, to fulfill their compact. Did she still exist, no matter where, Madame de Beauclerc remarked, she would most certainly have found some means of communicating with me. That she has not done so convinces me that she no longer exists and that there is no afterlife. Some months later, the lady who tells this story was visiting one of Madame de Beauclerc's friends, and was about to begin a game of cards with her, when a servant entered the room with a message from Madame de Beauclerc. The message was to the effect that if her friend wanted to see her again in this world, she must go to her at once. However, upon learning that Madame de Beauclerc was apparently well, her friend, who was suffering from a cold herself, declined to go, whereupon a second and more urgent request was received by her, accompanied by a casket containing Madame de Beauclerc's watch, chain, and various articles of jewellery. The recipient of the message and request then went, and her visitor went with her. On arriving at Madame de Beauclerc's, they were ushered into her presence and found her seemingly well, though extremely agitated. She had sent for them, she said, because she was quite certain her days were numbered. She had, at last, received a visit from her deceased friend, the Duchess of Mazarin. I perceived not how she entered, Madame de Beauclerc went on, but turning my eyes towards yonder corner of the room, I saw her stand in the same form and habit she was accustomed to appear in when living. Fain would I have spoken, but had not the power of utterance. She took a little circlet round the chamber, seeming rather to swim than walk, then stopped by the side of that Indian chest and, looking at me with her usual sweetness, said, "Beauclerc, between the hours of 12 and 1 this night you will be with me." Madame de Beauclerc added that directly she opened her mouth, to ask her friend's phantasm a question about the other world, it vanished. Madame de Beauclerc, having nothing further to relate, it was then close on midnight, her two visitors were trying to comfort her, when, suddenly, a change came over her face. Hitherto she had appeared to be in perfectly normal health, and she cried, "Oh, I am sick at heart." Mrs. Ward, her confidential maid, who was in the room all the time, at once gave her a restorative, but it had no effect. She grew rapidly worse, and in about half an hour she died, at the very hour the phantom had prophesied. Rumor asserts that the ghosts of the Duchess and Madame de Beauclerc have been seen in the palace, from time to time, but of these rumored appearances there does not seem to be any authentic record. So much has been written about Charles II's love intrigues, and he has been credited with so many, that one would suppose him to be the only king in civilized times who had had concubines, but, as a matter of fact, both George I and George II kept mistresses in St. James's Palace, and much scandal was caused by them. Among the most notorious were the Duchess of Kendal, the German mistress of George I, Mrs. Brett, one of his English mistresses, and Mrs. Howard, afterwards the Countess of Suffolk, the mistress of George II. Their goings-on might well have given rise to hauntings, for there is little doubt they were past mistresses in vices of all kinds, particularly those that appealed most to the very animal Georges. The Stuarts, one and all, no matter how profligate, and some of them, perhaps, could not have been more so, still retained certain of the gentlemen, but the same could not be said with regard to the earliest of our Hanoverian monarchs. One night Mr. Howard, missing his pretty wife from his home, made inquiries as to her whereabouts and learned that she had gone, clandestinely, to St. James's Palace. He, therefore, hurried thither in a fury, and forcing his way past every obstruction, he shouted for his wife, demanding that she should come to him at once. He had almost succeeded in finding his adored one, who was, as he feared, lying in the arms of her royal lover, when the latter, relinquishing his love-making for the moment, appeared upon the scene and ordered that the indignant husband should be thrust into the street and his eviction accompanied by the promise of a pension of £1,200 a year. About the year 1810 a tragedy, that might well account for some of the ghostly happenings, real or imaginary, in the palace, took place. The Duke of Cumberland, who resided in the palace at that date, had an Italian valet named Celis, who, for some reason or another, bore him a grudge. According to his own version of the affair, the Duke awoke one night, to hear someone in the room. It was Celis, armed with a knife, and a terrible struggle ensued. The Duke, however, being powerful and active, succeeded in overcoming the Italian, who, upon being allowed to retire to his room, immediately cut his throat, from fear of the consequence of his attempt to assassinate his royal master. There was, of necessity, an inquest, and, there being no evidence to show Celis was insane, a simple verdict offalo de se was returned. There can be little real doubt that the Duke's story was true, but unfortunately he was the least popular of an unpopular family, and horrible insinuations in reference to this tragedy were consequently levelled against him, mostly, of course, by the lower classes, who are always ready and eager to snatch at any opportunity of attacking the upper classes. A tradition that the Duke murdered his valet because his valet knew too much, and that the valet's ghost, in consequence, periodically haunts the palace, still apparently survives, for, according to rumor, the ghost of a man, in old-world clothes, with white face and dark, gleaming eyes, may still sometimes be seen at night in a certain part of the palace, the part where the tragedy is said to have been enacted. The Duke, who was thus, in my opinion, unwarrantably maligned, remained in England till 1837, when he went to Hanover, to assume the kingship of that country. He never returned to London, at least not in the material body. Some few years prior to the Celis mystery, as it was termed, a great sensation was caused in the West End by the appearance of a ghost in St. James's Park. It seems that some 20 or so years previously, that is to say in or about 1784, a sergeant in the Guards cut off his wife's head and threw her body into the canal, that then ran through the park. What he did with her head is not known, nor is it known what subsequently happened to him, whether, for instance, he was apprehended and punished, or whether he managed to elude conviction and escape punishment. With regard to the haunting in 1804, sentries on duty in the park at night declared they saw a headless woman there, and that she walked past them, greatly, of course, to their alarm, and then disappeared. The matter was much talked about, naturally, by the soldiers in the guard room, and sentries went to their various posts in the park, shivering and shaking. The weather, seemingly, mattered not. The headless phantom came on fine nights when the park was bathed in moonlight and the great, silent trees stood out even more clearly than in the daytime, and it came on dark, stormy nights, when the wind blew and howled among the trees and the rain fell in sheer torrents. Heat and cold, too, had no effect on it, its nightly appearance could be counted on. A soldier pacing to and fro, apprehensively watching the black shadows of the solemn oaks and elms, would suddenly see a figure emerge from behind some tree and glide noiselessly towards him. He did not challenge it, he shut his eyes and kept them shut till it had passed. Why? Because it was headless, the headless phantom of the murdered wife. The many stories told of it by affrighted sentries coming to the ears of the authorities, an official inquiry was made, and several depositions of men on oath were taken before Sir Richard Ford, one of the magistrates of Westminster. Here is one I do solemnly declare that when guard at Recruit House, now Wellington Barracks, on or about the 3rd inst, about 1:30 in the morning, I perceived the figure of a woman, without a head, rise from the earth, at a distance of about 2 feet before me. I was so alarmed at the circumstance that I had not the power to speak to it, which was my wish to have done. But I distinctly observed that the figure was dressed in a red striped gown, with red spots between each stripe, and that part of the dress and figure appeared to me to be enveloped in a cloud. In about the space of 2 minutes, whilst my eyes were fixed on the object, it vanished from my sight. I was perfectly sober and collected at the time, and being in great trepidation, called to the next sentinel, who met me halfway, and to whom I communicated the strange sight I had seen. Signed by George Jones, of Lieutenant Colonel Taylor's Company of Coldstream Guards. Westminster, January 15, 1804. The headless woman was not, however, the only source of trouble to the soldiers. Strange, uncanny sounds were frequently heard, not only in the park itself, but in certain of the buildings adjoining the park. With regard to them, too, depositions of soldiers on sentry duty were taken. This is one. I do hereby declare that, whilst on guard behind the Armory House, to the best of my recollection about 3 weeks ago, I heard at 12 o'clock a tremendous noise, which proceeded from the windows of an uninhabited house near to the spot where I was on duty. At the same time I heard a voice cry out, "Bring me a light! Bring me a light!" The last word was uttered in so feeble and so changeable a tone of voice that I concluded some person was ill, and consequently offered them my assistance. I could, however, obtain no answer to my proposal, although I repeated it several times, and as often heard the voice use the same terms. I endeavored to see the person who called out, but in vain. On a sudden the violent noise was renewed, which appeared to me to resemble sashes of windows lifted hastily up and down, but that they were moved in quick succession and in different parts of the house, nearly at the same time, so it seems to me impossible that one person could accomplish the whole business. I heard several of my regiment say they have heard similar noises and proceedings, but I have never heard the calls accounted for. Signed, Richard Donkin, 12th Company of Coldstream Guards, Whitehall, January 17, 1804. Although both cases, that is to say, that of the headless woman and the noises in the house, were thoroughly investigated, no explanation on physical grounds was forthcoming. Both affairs remained mysteries, soluble, so it seemed, only on the hypothesis of the superphysical. The finding, in 1795, during digging operations on the parade, of a skeleton, sex not determined, but thought to be that of a woman, gave rise to speculations regarding other sounds and sights believed to be ghostly. St. James's Park, indeed, as may be said of all the old London parks, has witnessed many tragedies, and I know, from experience, they are all at times badly haunted. One of the more recent ghosts in St. James's and the Green Park, not counting the headless woman phantom, that is still alleged to manifest itself periodically, is that of a man in evening clothes, said to be the earthbound spirit of an individual who either shot or poisoned himself on a bench or seat in the Green Park, probably, 30 or more years ago. Some time before the Great War I had a first-hand account of this ghost from a man who declared he had seen it. I was walking along the broad walk that runs parallel with Piccadilly, one wet afternoon in July, he told me, when a tall, grey-haired man, in evening clothes, caught me up and walked on ahead of me. That anyone should choose to take a walk on such a night for, although the rain could not be described as heavy, it was distinctly wetting, and therefore, to most people, discomforting bareheaded, and without overcoat or mackintosh, struck me as somewhat remarkable, and, my curiosity roused, I observed him more closely, perhaps, than I should have done otherwise. I noticed that although my steps produced a slight crunching sound on the moist soil, his made no noise whatever, despite the fact that he was wearing dancing pumps, another idiosyncrasy. He continued walking ahead of me till we came to a spot where several paths intersected, and I was wondering which path he would select, when, to my amazement, he suddenly began to grow fainter and fainter until, finally, he vanished altogether, and I found myself staring into space. Realizing, then, that what I had seen was a ghost, I felt, if not actually frightened, rather scared. There is a hillock in the Green Park, and on it a clump of trees. Some years ago, a member of the now defunct International Club for Psychic Research, in Regent Street, who is now defunct himself, used to confide in me his adoration for a certain tree in this clump. He wrote sonnets to it, made love to it, serenaded it with his favorite instrument, the flute. He was, I am convinced, deeply enamored of it, and if half the things he told me about it were true, It must have been a very wonderful tree indeed. He said it used to sigh and murmur when he spoke to it, but he could never interpret what it said, because it seemed to be speaking in a foreign tongue and its voice sounded so far away. Of course, there are haunted trees in the Green Park as well as in Hyde Park, trees that harbor phantoms that have once inhabited material human bodies, and phantoms with little resemblance to anything either human or animal. I have met people who, with seeming perfect sincerity, have declared they have encountered these various kinds of tree spirits, and I believe that some of the trees that harbor phantoms exercise a peculiarly evil and harmful influence. However, according to my friend of the International Club, there was nothing ghostly or baleful about the tree he loved. It was associated with something superphysical, it is true, but it was to fairyland rather than to ghostland that superphysical belonged. Of course, many people may, and undoubtedly will, say that this man who made love to a tree was mad, and eccentric to a degree he undoubtedly was, but it must not be forgotten that in the south and west of Ireland, in Oregon, and in certain other countries, there are trees said to be obsessed or haunted at times both by ghosts and by fairies.